Hello there, lovely people. It's Alex from Nintendo Life here, and yes, the title is not a lie. I have played The Legend of Zelda Echoes of Wisdom for a reasonable amount of time. Not as long as I would like, admittedly, which is a bit of a spoiler to suggest I enjoyed myself. But yes, as it so often happens, Nintendo invited me down to play the game early, so I did, so I'm going to tell you what I think. It's the usual. But anyway, that's more than enough waffling. Let's dive right into things. Let's not beat around the bush. How long did I play? Was it 10 minutes, 20, maybe 30, 40, 50, 60, 70? No. 80 minutes. 80 lovely minutes of The Legend of Zelda Echoes of Wisdom. And I've got to be honest, I loved every second of it, which probably shouldn't be surprising. It is a Zelda game, but there were a lot of things that I was really surprised about, and really pleasantly so. You know, there was nothing nasty lurking in the corner, at least not that I found anyway. I believe I was in a very early portion of the game. I just met Tri, and I had to sort of weave my way past some guards, and this is where the ecosystem comes into play. Tri was like, hey, do this and all this sort of thing, you know, you can make things appear using this funny stick that you found. And absolutely, that's what you do. You learn things very simply, and the puzzles and getting past the guards is extremely basic. It is very, sort of obvious what's going to happen. It doesn't require a lot of thinking, but it is introducing you to the mechanics, and thankfully they do ramp up things later on, which you would expect, but even so, it's just nice that it's there. It's nice to have it confirmed, is it not? I say it's baby stuff, and it absolutely is, but what's more important is not just that it introduced you to the mechanics, but introduced you into different ways in which the mechanics can be exploited, and I mean exploited in a sort of an intentional gamified way, not like breaking the game or anything like that. So you generally, you will start off and you'll probably go over. There's sort of like a big pile of stuff, and you can just build like a little table or a little stool or something. You just hop up there, because you can jump at any time, which is a really nice feature. And you can just jump up there and run kind of over the top of the guards, as it were. Very straightforward, very simple. However, as you go further on, you get different echoes, you know, oh, suddenly now I've got a rock, and now I've got a vase and things like that, and you can, or a pot, I suppose, technically, it's Zelda. And you can pick up the echoed pot and you can throw it, distract the guard, and then run when they're not looking. Nice little feature. You could also get some crates and block off the path, and the guard's going to go, what? Going to go over, look at the crates and go, whatever, and go back to their post, and you can just zip right by. You can also make a pot and not distract the guard with it, but you can hop inside. And you know how in Wind Waker and Breath of the Wild as well, you could pick up a barrel as Link and wear it, and you could walk a little bit, his little legs were sticking out, and then you'd stop and you'd drop it, and they'd think, oh, it's a barrel. Now it's this with a pot, and it's... I don't know whether it's funnier, but it's at least as funny to just be going hop, hop. It's top quality humor. And don't get me wrong, it's nothing revolutionary. It's nothing that we haven't seen in games before. As I said, the pot mechanic is very, very, very reminiscent of the barrel mechanic from Wind Waker. But it really just sort of lays that foundation for you, and it's basic, but it sort of says, look, there's multiple ways you can do this. It's verging on emergent gameplay, which shouldn't be entirely surprising from the trailers that we've seen, but yeah, I can confirm it is bordering on that. After that, you get outside, it's all puzzle-based, and then finally you come up against some Zols, and yeah, you have to then do some combat, and there's not a lot you can do at that point. There are things you can do. You can make a rock, pick it up, and throw it at them, which is fine, don't get me wrong, but it is a little bit of a roundabout way to go about combat. And that may initially sound like a bad thing, but hold your flippin' horses for just a second there, sir. Previous Zelda games, particularly 2D top-down ones in my opinion, have always been about the puzzles. The puzzles are the challenge. The combat can be reasonably trivialized. If you're good at the game, if you played another Zelda game when you pick up a brand new one, it's not going to blow your mind. You're just going to be like, yeah, shield, sword, yeah, all that sort of thing. It's essentially kind of trivialized. It's not hard. But the puzzles are where you're going to find roadblocks. In Echoes of Wisdom, it's completely flipped on its head. The puzzles are, I don't want to say trivialized, but there's so many different ways you can do things. You know, it's if you have a gap to get across, you can do so many different things. At one point, I got this spider that can create like a string upwards, well, a bit of a web, you know, a spider's string. And within an enclosed environment, admittedly I didn't test it outside, which I'm still annoyed at, but I'm certain it wouldn't work because obviously it shoots straight up. But if you have that echo, every single height-based thing where you just have to get up to a high base place is completely and utterly trivialized. It's so simple. The puzzles, I would argue, are not so much simpler, but they're more open, so they're easier to solve. They're in some ways more satisfying as well, because it's not like you've got to work out what a Pole's voice is, thanks Awakening. But the other side of that is that combat is now absolutely not trivialized. It may be that later on in the game it gets easier, but certainly with the echoes that I had, combat was, I don't want to say a nightmare, but it was really challenging, and it kind of discouraged you from just running in and just swiping with your sword, because you don't have one. You have to work out, oh god, you know, sort of there's a couple of Zols coming up. What am I going to do? I'll just quickly switch. I'll get some urchins out. Urchins are just a good all-rounder. So you just stick an urchin down, blah, and you try and make it land on the Zol and it'll do damage and stuff like that. Or you can spawn another enemy and have them fight, but they will die in the same way, and what will often happen is they will cancel each other out, which is fine, but it's not very satisfying. And then you come up against something like a moblin, and moblins in Link's Awakening is the most obvious example, were not exactly tricky, to say the least. Yeah, you know, the ones that throw spears, you know, sort of like, oh, okay, I've got to put my shield up, I suppose. And, you know, sort of you've got to try and close that gap, but that's all you've got to do. In Echoes of Wisdom, the first moblin I came across, I was like, oh my god, I have no idea what to do. I just spawned a load of ropes, they're snakes, they call them ropes, and just like let them, I just like go ham, just kill it. And then it got up on a little bit of a ledge. I don't think it was an intentional decision by the moblin, or whether it was intentional by the developers to try and counteract this tactic, this kind of spamming tactic, but it doesn't work. Really, the ropes couldn't get up. I could have done something maybe with a bit more range. I tried urchins, nothing was really working, so I had to create rocks and pick them up and throw them, and that is slow. But then, as soon as I defeated the moblin, I could spawn a moblin, because every time you defeat an enemy, if you've not got the echo before, you can just get it, defeat it, it's yours now. It's Pokemon. And you might think, oh, well, okay, if moblins are hard, then that trivializes the combat, doesn't it? No. We'll move on from that, but we will come back to the combat later on. There was one particular section that was ball-achingly difficult. One thing that I feel was particularly pleasantly surprising for me was the fact that there's a lot more 2D Zelda DNA in here than I initially thought. You know, you may have seen the video where Felix and I were like, oh, Echoes of Wisdom, it's so Breath of the Wild, and that is true to a degree. You are free. I mean, the bit that I played was largely a linear path. There were tangents, but then you always had to come back to that original path. But I think it was kind of tutorializing the game a little. But also, there are just straight up dungeons in this game. I played through a dungeon in the Still World, and it was excellent. Was it in the Still World? Yes. And the dungeon was reasonably straightforward. Again, the puzzles were, I don't want to say trivialized, but because they're so open, it's just sort of like, there's a gap there, and it's like, okay, bed, I'm across, you know, simple stuff like that. But it is also the first dungeon. Have you gone back and played the original, like, first dungeon in Link's Awakening? It's an absolute cakewalk. But I can't deny, even though I'm a big fan of Tears of the Kingdom, Breath of the Wild's gameplay and all that sort of stuff, it was really refreshing to go back to a typical standard dungeon layout. And yeah, it was a reasonably linear dungeon, again, with tangents, but that's like so many dungeons, in fact, pretty much all dungeons in Zelda. You'll be looping back around and stuff like that, but yeah, I mean, there was even some of that in this one. It was just nice, it was just refreshing, and I didn't know I wanted it as much as I realize I do, if that makes any sense. It was a very simple dungeon, but it was very refreshing to go back to it. And then I got about halfway through the dungeon, maybe 2/3, something like that, and who shows their face but Link? Sort of? I don't imagine it's really Link, because the Still World is kind of creating these copies, or at least these copies are coming out of the Still World, so I imagine it's not really Link, also because he disappeared into a puff of smoke, which is a bit of an unsatisfying end to him. And you know what I was saying earlier about typical top-down Zelda games where the combat can be kind of trivialized? Yeah, that kind of shines through when you're fighting Link, because he is absolutely hard as nails. I never want to be a Moblin or any other kind of enemy in a Zelda game, because he just starts coming at you and you're like, okay, well, you know, I'll spawn an urchin or something like that, but he's coming at you with a shield out all the time, and it's like, well, I've got to get around the back of him, but he won't. He's looking at you the whole time with his shield up going towards it, and you're just like, okay, and you have to sort of like, maybe you can run around and break the line of sight, that sort of thing. And that works, but he very quickly, you know, twigs you. I don't know whether he hears you or what, or whether he can smell you, but he will turn around and maybe you'll get in a hit with an urchin, maybe not. One thing you can do, and one thing I tried, was getting a Moblin to spawn and then distracting him and trying to stay away from him, because you can't get too close, because he'll just immediately just go blah and do, well, not a load of damage, but enough. All the while you're just hoping that the Moblin is going to have the accuracy to actually throw the spear and get him in the back. And it works sometimes, but not as often as I would hope. Fighting Link was really, really tough. It should have been easier because I was being a dingus, but at the same time, I think it was a reasonable, you know, sort of dingus mentality to have. I don't want to get into too many details, but at one point earlier in the dungeon, I had to remove the shield from something in order to progress. And, you know, you use that using the bind thing. So you go, wah, and you just pull it back. It's kind of like Ultra Hand, essentially. And you pull it off and, yeah, you know, progress. Okay, great. You know, it was a very simple thing. And I was like, very straightforward. And then, of course, I didn't put 2 and 2 together until much later into the Link fight. But he's got his shield up. Whip it off, baby. Whip it off. I mean, you don't have to do that. I reinforce that. I got him down to less than half health without removing his shield. So there's so many ways that you can take him out. But, you know, removing the shield arguably suddenly makes him easier because he doesn't have any protection at the front. Brilliant. He gets about twice as fast, though. So even though you can outrun him, you can't look at him. Well, you can ZL target, I suppose. I probably should have done that. But he starts jumping at you and all this sort of thing, and it's genuinely quite frightening. And you suddenly, well, yeah, no, he's got no defense, but he's got more offense now. Oh, honestly, it was really beautifully made. And that little bit of tutorializing without explicitly telling you the whole shield thing, absolutely stellar. Stellar game design. Really, really lovely. I never had to be explicitly told. I just made the connections in my head. Eventually I defeated him. It took me a surprising amount of time, actually. Going back and doing it a second time, I'm certain I'd be a lot faster, but you know, that's neither here nor there. And then the sword was left behind. I don't know what the hell that sword is. It doesn't look like any sword that has ever been in a Zelda game. It looks closest to maybe the white sword, but even then, that's really a stretch. And it's not the sword that the presumably real Link has in the reveal trailer. It could be a standard design change in the final game, you know, Link has that different design sword, but I don't know. I think it's an indicator that it's something else. Ooh. You grab the sword, I mean, it says Link on it as well, so I don't know, maybe it's his old sword or something like that. But you grab it, and then suddenly you can turn into sword fighter form. And my goodness, it's like a breath of fresh air. It's like suddenly going, it's like going back to the easier Zeldas. Not to say that Echoes of Wisdom is especially hard either, but you know what I mean. It makes combat trivial, completely trivial. And I must admit, at first, I was a little bit disappointed. I was like, couldn't you have just made the whole game just about the echoes? And, you know, sort of rather than relying on, okay, here you go, here's a sword and that sort of thing. But at the same time, after I'd given it a go for a while, I was like, okay, no, I get it now. It makes everything easier, absolutely, but you only get to have that effect for, I think, probably less than 15 seconds, I would say, maybe 12, something like that. It looks like you can level it up, but, you know, it really is kind of like almost like a panic button. It's sort of like, oh my god, you know, sort of, no, I'm being overwhelmed. Sword fighter mode. You also jump higher, which is fun as well, and can no doubt help in certain puzzles. I didn't use it in that sense, but yeah, it was good fun, and I think it's actually going to be a really nice inclusion. And shortly after that, I got myself to the boss room, and I managed to face my first boss, the Seismic Talus. What was really interesting is, once again, how many different ways you could tackle this boss. The way that I did it is I was sort of like, okay, well, you know, I'll just use bind, I'll just grab the glowing thing, you know, treat it kind of like the, God, what the hell were they called? Those big things in Tears of the Kingdom made of cubes, and you just sort of whip out the cube, and, you know, essentially the boss is one of those, which is... It's fine, it's a first boss, and it's easy enough. You know, just whip it out and then... Careful. You rip the orb out, and then you are encouraged to turn into sword fighter form by getting a load of the energy, because that's one of the things. You've got to fill up your energy in order to get it even into sword fighter form, and you just go whammer jammer on it. You know, it's simple, straightforward. Maybe you can use echoes at the same time. That could be a fun sort of way to maybe speedrun things a bit. Or you don't have to do that. You can just like spawn a rock, pick it up and throw it at the orb and do damage that way, or spawn a load of enemies and just have them mob it. You know, it will make absolute mincemeat of them, but you know, it works. Just spawn a load more when they die. And I've got to be honest, I want to go back. I want to go back and fight that boss again, because there's so many different ways that I could do it. And I only explored one of them. Maybe I should have tried out multiple during that time, but I was running out of time. They were like, there's 2 minutes left, and I was like, 2 minutes? Plenty of time. Internal panic. But I managed it. I defeated it, and everything was happy. And yeah, that's where it ended. That's where my play session ended, unfortunately. But I had an absolute joyous time with it. It really was just utterly superb. It's so familiar in one way, but so different in so many others. And it's so refreshing. It's kind of a bit like how Breath of the Wild first felt. It's sort of like, yeah, it feels like Zelda, but it's so different. And this is doing that, but in a very different way. There's some similar DNA, absolutely, but I'm chuffed to bits with what I played, and I am gagging to play more. I absolutely am. The aesthetic is fantastic. I'd forgotten that bit. The performance, I've got to be honest, it's not great. The performance is not great. I don't think it impacts gameplay that much. It doesn't feel quite as egregious in certain areas as, say, Link's Awakening, but that's because I think in Link's Awakening, it happened only in very specific moments, whereas in this, it's kind of fluctuating between the two rather than 60 or 30, 60 or 30. It's more sort of like... There's a part of me that wonders whether maybe they should have just capped it at 30. But at the same time, it's not the end of the world. It's not a big deal. It's a very gorgeous game, so it's fine. You know what? I'm not going to lose any sleep over it. The game is so good, I don't care. And in a very weird way, that's kind of like my primary takeaway from this game, is not that I don't care about it. The game doesn't care how you solve things. It just matters that you solve it, which is emergent gameplay. It's sort of like, here's an objective, how do you want to tackle it? And you're like, got all these things that'll do it? And it goes... yeah, any of those is fine. It doesn't care. And that's wonderful. Again, it's a very Breath of the Wild-esque thing, but in a way, I almost feel like it's more so here. It's certainly less physics-based and more just sort of like different... It's weird because it's simultaneously more open and less open at the same time. Because it's not, again, physics-based. It's not like, oh, I can drop a big rock onto enemies and have that sort of freedom of movement with 3D and stuff like that. I mean, I think you can drop stuff on enemies. It doesn't usually do stuff. I did put a bed on top of a Zol and it just jumped through it. But it's so satisfying. And this is the early level stuff. I can only imagine how much more involved it gets later on. And I can't wait. I honestly can't wait. But what do you think? Do you think I'm barking up the wrong tree? Have you watched and analysed every trailer and you've got a better idea than I have? Let us know with a comment down below. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, then why don't you create an echo of that subscribe button so you can be subscribed twice? And be sure to check out NintendoLife.com for all sorts of lovely Nintendo-related content. Thank you again for watching. Bye-bye.